Plan B measures and restore the ancient liberties of this country. Mr. Speaker, I know that the whole House will be delighted that Her Majesty the Queen has given permission for a special medal to be awarded to all those who deployed to Kabul. Operation Pitting saw our servicemen and women deliver the largest British evacuation since the Second World War. The whole country can be immensely proud of their service. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Wendy Chin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year we were told by the Prime Minister there were no Downing Street parties. Then it turned out there were parties, but we were assured that no rules were broken. Last week we heard that rules may have been broken, but that he thought it was a work event. And now yesterday from the man who wrote the rules, it was, well, nobody told me what those rules were. Mr. Speaker, 5 weeks ago the people of North Shropshire were clear, and the people of North East Fife are being clear to me now. No matter the excuse, there is no excuse for taking the British people for fools. Will the Prime Minister agree it is now time for him to resign?
No, Mr. Speaker, but what I can tell her is that, as I said to the House last week, I apologise sincerely for any misjudgments that were made, but she must contain her impatience, Mr. Speaker, and wait for the inquiry next week before she draws any of the conclusions that she's just asserted.
John Burrow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Latest evidence and research shows that the UK is the most attractive country in the world amongst young people across the G20. Amid intense soft power competition from other countries, including China, can the Prime Minister assure me and other members of the British Council All-Party Group that the government will meet the British Council's funding requirements to ensure it doesn't have to close any more offices overseas, and to ensure that it commits all its energy to retaining our top spot?
Mr. Speaker, I entirely share my right honourable friend's enthusiasm for the British Council, which is a wonderful institution that we all love, and that's why we're providing through the FCDO £189 million of funding this year, a 27% increase, Mr. Speaker, in spite of all the difficulties this country is facing, 27% increase on the previous financial year. We've also provided a loan facility of up to £145 million to support all the wonderful work that the British Council does.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by warmly welcoming... Can I start...
Here. Listen to the Prime Minister.
Can I just say, I expect people to listen to the Prime Minister. I certainly don't want the Leader of the Opposition shouted down. You might not like the day, but this is the day that we've got. Yes, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not bothered. I assumed it was directed over here. Can I start by warmly welcoming the honourable member for Bury South to his new place and to the Parliamentary Labour Party. Mr. Speaker, like so many people up and down the country, he has concluded that the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party have shown themselves incapable of offering the leadership and government this country deserves, whereas the Labour Party stands ready to provide an alternative government that the country can be proud of. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party has changed, and so has the Conservative Party. He and anyone else who wants to build a new Britain built on decency, security, prosperity and respect is welcome in my Labour Party. Every week, the Prime Minister offers absurd and frankly unbelievable defences to the Downing Street parties, and each week it unravels.
I've been elected the chair. I don't need to be told how to conduct the business. So if somebody wants to do some direction, I'll start directing them out of the chamber. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I see the very noise. I'm sure the Chief Whip has told them to bring their own booze.
Order. Let's try and get on with questions. It's going to be a long day if not. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, first he said there were no parties. Then the video landed, blowing that defence out the water. Next he said he was sickened and furious when he found out about the parties, until it turned out that he himself was at the Downing Street garden party. Then last week he said he didn't realise he was at a party, and surprise, surprise, no one believed him. So this week he's got a new defence. Nobody warned me that it was against the rules. That's it. Nobody told him. Since the Prime Minister wrote the rules, why on earth does he think that his new defence is going to work for him?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, he talks about the rules, and let me repeat what I said to the honourable lady across the aisle earlier on. Of course, Mr. Speaker, we must wait for the outcome of the inquiry. But I renew what I've said, Mr. Speaker. But when it comes to his view,
Nobody believes what you said.
Can we have a little less? I want to this Prime Minister like I wanted to leader of the opposition. I want the same courtesy from both sides. Prime Minister.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, if we'd listened to the right honourable gentleman about COVID restrictions, which is the substance of his question, then, Mr. Speaker, we would still be we would have been in lockdown after July. If we listened to, if this is the truth, if we listened to the Labour front bench in the run-up to Christmas and New Year, Mr. Speaker, we would have stayed in restrictions with huge damage to the economy. And it's because of the judgments that I've taken and that we have taken in Downing Street that we now have the fastest growing economy in the G7 and GDP, Mr. Speaker, now back up above pre-pandemic levels. And as for Bury South, Mr. Speaker, as for Bury South, let me say to the right gentleman, Mr. Speaker, by all leave, may I say to the right honourable gentleman that the Conservative Party won Bury South for the first time in generations under this Prime Minister, with an agenda of uniting and levelling up and delivering for the people of Bury South. And, Mr. Speaker, we will win again in Bury South at the next election under this Prime Minister.
Look, it's important I want to hear both sides, and I don't want this continuous chant, because if we do, there'll be less people on these benches, and the same on the other side. I expect both sides to be heard with courtesy. Keir Starmer.
Bury South is now a Labour seat, Prime Minister.
Sorry. Order. Did somebody want me to apologise? No, somebody shouted apologise. I hope it wasn't aimed at me. No. And so we'll also have less from that corner. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not only did he write the rules, but some of his staff say they did warn him about attending the party on the 20th of May 2020. Now, I've heard the Prime Minister's very carefully crafted response to that accusation. It almost sounds like a lawyer wrote it. So I'll be equally careful with my question. When did the Prime Minister first become aware that any of his staff had concerns about the 20th of May party?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for repeating the question that he's already asked. We have answered, Mr. Speaker, that it is for the inquiry to come forward with an explanation of what happened, and I'm afraid he simply must wait. But he asks about my staff, Mr. Speaker. He asks about my staff and what my staff are doing and what they have told me. And I can tell him, Mr. Speaker, that they have taken decisions throughout this pandemic that he has opposed to open up in July, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, to mount the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, and Mr. Speaker, to double the speed of the booster rollout, with the result that we have the most open economy in Europe, Mr. Speaker, and we have more people in employment and more employees on the payroll now than there were before the pandemic began. That is what my staff have been working on in Downing Street, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud of them.
Keir Starmer.
So, Mr. Speaker, apparently Sue Gray is going to tell the Prime Minister when he first became aware that his staff had concerns about the May 20th. The Prime Minister's account gets more extraordinary with each version of his defence. If the Prime Minister's new defence were true, it requires him to suggest that his staff are not being truthful when they say they warned him about the party. It requires the Prime Minister to expect us to believe that whilst every other person who was invited on the 20th of May to the party was told it was a social occasion, he alone was told it was a work meeting. It also requires the Prime Minister to ask us to accept that as he waded through the empty bottles and platters of sandwiches, he didn't realise it was a party. Does the Prime Minister realise how ridiculous that sounds?
Mr. Speaker, I've said what I've said about the events in Number 10. He will have to wait for the report. And Mr. Speaker, I think you know he asks for further clarification. I think there are lots of people who are interested. I say this entirely in passing, Mr. Speaker. Lots of people are interested in the exact legal justification from the learned leader of the opposition for the picture of him drinking a pint of beer or a bottle of beer. Mr. Speaker, I merely perhaps he could tell the House about that in a minute, Mr. Speaker. But what I can tell the House is that throughout the pandemic, people across government have been working flat out to protect the British public with huge quantities of PPE, so we can now make 80% in this country, with the biggest and most generous furlough scheme virtually anywhere in the world, and the fastest. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, if we listened to them, we would have stayed in the European Medicines Agency, and we would never have been able to deliver the vaccine rollout at the speed that we did.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister thinks the only accusation he faces that he once had a beer with a takeaway, then Operation Save Big Dog is in deeper trouble than I thought. If a Prime Minister misleads Parliament, should they resign?
So, Mr. Speaker, let's be absolutely clear. The Right Honourable Gentleman is continuing to ask a series of questions which he knows will be fully addressed by the inquiry. He is wasting this House's time. He's wasting the people's time, Mr. Speaker. He continues to be completely irrelevant, Mr. Speaker, because we have an inquiry. We have an inquiry, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not going to anticipate that inquiry any further. What I can tell him is that it is because of the judgments that were taken in Downing Street and because of the willingness of the British people to put trust, by the way, Mr. Speaker, in those judgments, to come forward in huge numbers to get vaccinated, which people did, and I thank them for it from the bottom of my heart. People did that because they listened to our messages, Mr. Speaker, and it's as a result of that that we now have the fastest growing economy in the G7 and youth unemployment, which he ought to care about, youth unemployment at a record low, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Well, I know it's not going well, Prime Minister, but look on the bright side. At least the staff at Number 10 know how to pack a suitcase. Mr. Speaker, last year, Her Majesty the Queen sat alone when she marked the passing of the man she'd been married to for 73 years. She followed the rules of the country that she leads. On the eve of that funeral, a suitcase was filled with booze and wheeled into Downing Street. A DJ played and staff partied late into the night. The Prime Minister has been forced to hand an apology to Her Majesty the Queen. Isn't he ashamed but he didn't hand in his resignation at the same time.
Mr. Speaker, I understand why the right honourable gentleman continues to politicise issues.
Sorry, Prime Minister. We normally would not, and quite rightly, mention the royal family. We don't get into discussions on the royal family.
Well, in that case, Mr. Speaker, I must ask the right honourable gentleman to withdraw it.
I've dealt with it. Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer, are you going to...
Won't withdraw it.
Order. Prime Minister, we don't want to go through that again. I'll make the decisions. The answer is that the next question I'm going back to Keir Starmer to ask his final question. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst the Prime Minister wastes energy defending the indefensible, people's energy bills are rocketing. Labour has a plan to deal with it. Axe VAT for everyone, provide extra support for the hardest hit, and pay for it with a one-off tax on oil and gas companies. A serious plan for a serious problem. What's the government offering? Nothing. Too distracted by their own chaos to do their job. While Labour was setting out plans to heat homes, he was buying a fridge to keep the party wine chilled. While we were setting out plans to keep bills down, he was planning parties. And while we were setting out plans to save jobs in the steel industry, he was trying to save just one job, his own. Doesn't the country deserve so much better than this out of touch, out of control, out of ideas, and soon to be out of office Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what this government has been doing to look after the people of this country throughout this pandemic and beyond. We have been cutting the cost of living, helping them with the living wage. We've been cutting taxes for people on low pay, Mr. Speaker. We've been increasing payments for people suffering the costs of fuel.
Prime Minister,
look after people.
Can I just say to everyone in here, our constituents wants to hear the questions and the answers. The great British public, the members of this United Kingdom which you're representing, they need to hear. Please, let's hear the questions and answers. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to look after people throughout this pandemic and beyond. But we've also, Mr. Speaker, been cutting crime by 10%, putting 11,000 more police officers already out on the street. Record home building last year, Mr. Speaker. More homes than at any time in the last 30 years. We are building 40 new hospitals, Mr. Speaker. Gigabit broadband has gone up from 9% coverage in our country to 65% already. And as I said already, I think 3 times or 4 times today, we have more people, more employees on the payroll now than before the pandemic began. And unemployment, youth unemployment, at a record low, Mr. Speaker. And when the history of this pandemic comes to be written, and the history of the Labour Party comes to be written, and believe me, they are history and will remain history, Mr. Speaker, it will show that we delivered while they dithered, and we vaccinated while they vacillated, Mr. Speaker. And the reason we've been able to lift restrictions faster than any other country in Europe, and we have the most open economy and the most open society in Europe, Mr. Speaker, is thanks to the booster rollout and thanks to the work of staff up and down Whitehall, across government, throughout the NHS, Mr. Speaker, and I am intensely proud of what this government has done.
If you let the questions come, Mark Palsey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from the excellent news on the economy and jobs, the Prime Minister will remember my question to him last June about proposals for a gigafactory in Coventry. Last week, local councils granted outline planning permission to create 6,000 new skilled jobs, to secure many thousands of others, inject £2.5 billion into our local economy and level up across our region. with fast-rising demand for greener and cleaner electric cars, may I ask him for his support to ensure the swift delivery of this vitally important project?
I thank my honourable friend for campaigning for this wonderful project, and we are supporting the electric vehicle industry. We made another £350 million available through the Automotive Transformation Fund, on top of the £500 million commitment that we've already made in the 10-point plan. And I know that the campaign for Coventry Airport is an excellent one. I look forward to seeing how it develops.
We now come to the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week was supposed to be Operation Save Big Dog, but it's quickly become Operation Dog's Dinner. Over the past few days, we've had more damaging revelations about Downing Street rulemaking, more evidence that Parliament has been misled, and an even longer list of ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous excuses from the Prime Minister. First he claimed there were no parties. Then he wasn't present. Then he admitted he was at them, but he didn't know it was a party. And then, Mr. Speaker, the latest sorry excuse is really the most pathetic of them all. Nobody told me. Nobody told me. Nobody told the Prime Minister he was breaking his own rules. Absolutely pathetic. The Prime Minister, you know, what a look. The Prime Minister laughing once again, laughing at the British public. The Prime Minister is taking the public for fools. Nobody believes him. Will the Prime Minister finally take responsibility, resign? Go, Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, but I thank him for his question again, and let me just remind him that there's an inquiry that is due to conclude. I believe he is wrong in what he asserts, Mr. Speaker, but we'll have to wait and see what the inquiry says. But, Mr. Speaker, I think the most important thing from the point of view of the UK government is that we're coming out of the restrictions that we've been in. I'm delighted to see that that's happening in Scotland as well, and that is very largely thanks to the wonderful cooperation that we continue to see across the whole of the UK, though you wouldn't believe it to hear it from him.
Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid nobody is buying this act anymore. There ought to be some respect and dignity from the Prime Minister. Let's remind ourselves, more than 150,000 of our citizens have died, and he's partying, he's laughing. Mr. Speaker, it simply isn't acceptable. The fake contrition, the endless excuses, the empty promises that it will be different only if we give him one last chance. This is a Prime Minister who arrogantly believes that he's above the rules, a Prime Minister who brazenly twists the truth, a Prime Minister who simply isn't fit for office. The Prime Minister's former Chief Advisor has said that he lied to Parliament, breaking the ministerial code. Prime Minister, a resignation offence. Public trust is hemorrhaging. With every day that passes, this Tory government loses even more credibility. When will the Tory MPs finally do the right thing? Show the Prime Minister the door.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman, but I must say that I disagree with him, and I think that when you look at the levels of trust that the British people, people in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, across the whole country have shown in government, that there is the single biggest index, Mr. Speaker, of that trust has been their willingness to come forward voluntarily, Mr. Speaker, unlike many other countries in the world, to get vaccinated on a scale not seen anywhere else in Europe. And that is because of our ability and the NHS's ability to persuade people that it's the right thing. It's a fantastic thing. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, it's also a tribute to the United Kingdom, because that vaccine rollout was a UK effort.
Paul Benson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to exporting, as you're well aware, file punches well above its weight. And the Prime Minister saw this when he visited BAE Systems' factory of the future in Lancashire last year. In addition, fantastic local businesses such as Helical Technologies, Tangerine Holdings and Nature's Aid are doing a great job for flying the flag for Lancashire globally. But I've also got many smaller businesses who are eager to get exporting into new markets. What steps is the Prime Minister taking to help foil businesses make the most of Brexit and maximise export potential?
Well, I thank him for championing. I thank him for what he's doing to champion trade with Latin America, and I've no doubt that businesses, small businesses such as Squire Hare, are eager to get into those new markets, and we will do everything that we can to help and support him in his efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the cost of living crisis deepens, this government's priorities get ever more remote from my Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath constituency. Only this week, I learned a veteran in my constituency, James Scott, took his own life as a result of his struggle with mounting financial pressures. This is a government who are found to have acted unlawfully by the High Court over COVID contracts and now preparing to write off £4.3 billion allocated to those COVID schemes. Why can the UK government find billions of pounds for profiteers and fraudsters, but they can't find compassion to treat the people with dignity, lifting the benefits cap and reinstating the cut to universal credit?
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I want to say how sorry I am for what he's had to say about James Scott, and this government does as much as we can to support veterans, and that's why we published the Veterans Action Plan only the other day, Mr. Speaker. But what we're also doing is ensuring that we support people throughout this crisis. He mentions, and I've said in my answer to the right honourable gentleman, many of the steps that we're taking to protect people on low incomes, and we will continue to do more, Mr. Speaker. He attacks the contracts for PPE. Actually, I think it was an astonishing thing at great speed to be able to give this country 17 billion items of PPE, thanks to the efforts of people across Whitehall. Mr. Speaker, this country is now capable of producing 80% of our own PPE.
Kate Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Shortly before Christmas, my constituent, Oliver Freckleton, was found at home having been stabbed to death on the eve of his 20th birthday. Yesterday, his heartbroken parents held their son's funeral. Oliver leaves behind a partner and a baby daughter, and 2 teenagers have been arrested for his murder. Now, this tragic event leaves behind a devastated family, friends, and a very worried community. I'm grateful for the work that Staffordshire Police is undertaking to tackle violent crime in my constituency, and the extra 149 additional police officers recruited is very welcome. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that a multi-stakeholder approach is vital to tackling crimes amongst our young people? And what can the government do to support not just the police, but schools, colleges and local authorities in working to address this issue?
My honourable friend, first of all, I'm very sad to hear the news of the loss of her constituent, Oliver. And like so many victims of violent crime, the answer, as is the case with so many victims, the answer is not just policing, though that is vitally important, and that's why we're investing so massively in 20,000 more police officers and supporting them with toughening the law, Mr. Speaker. But it's also, as she rightly says, important to get all the institutions of the state to work together: schools, colleges, the social services and the health service, mental health service as well.
Jessica Morton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Why is it so hard for this Prime Minister to admit that he made the rules, so he should know the rules and he should follow the rules? Everyone out there knows it's as simple as that. And if he had any shred of compassion for all those out there who've suffered through this, he'd go.
Mr. Speaker, I entirely understand people's feelings, and I entirely support what she says about obeying the rules when you make the rules. She's completely right. On the other hand, I do urge her to wait, as I've said to the benches opposite, to wait until next week.
Paul Holt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The opposition have been told there's going to be an inquiry. They've visited every single question on one issue. Well, my constituents wants to get on with other things. In January 2021, the government estimated that at least 800 million will be released from the Dormant Assets Scheme extension. does he agree with me that funding through a new community wealth fund will be a catalyst to level up the most left-behind communities, and the bill should include specific provision for a consultation on the scope, shape and nature of such a fund?
Mr. Speaker, we certainly are legislating to, thank you very much, and we will be legislating to expand the dormant assets scheme to include new financial assets, which would unlock an estimated £880 million. We'll be considering how to spend the English portion of that, and the Community Wealth Fund that he proposes is certainly an option, and I thank him very much.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Anne has told me a friend saw the ambulance outside the house on the night Anne's husband died. She wasn't allowed to go into the house to comfort her friend. Anne's husband went to his rest in an almost empty building, while scores of his friends stood freezing outside. Anne went home to an empty house to grieve the rest of the day alone. My constituent Susan wasn't allowed to go in the ambulance or even follow the ambulance, blue light and all, after her husband had a heart attack. Other constituents had the heartbreaking realisation they weren't allowed to go into care homes to break the news in person to their relatives that someone else in the family had died. Mr. Speaker, in their words, not mine, in their words, the Prime Minister is a charlatan, a hypocrite and a liar. What will he now say to my constituents?
Look, I know you're repeating what your constituents said. I want more moderate and temperate language. Prime Minister, you might just want to deal with the general question, certainly not the answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to repeat that I understand the feelings that he has relayed to me, as I said last week, and I sympathise very deeply with the feelings, and I understand why people feel as they do. And I thank people very much for everything they have done. I recognise the enormous sacrifice that people have made. I apologise for misjudgments that may have been made in number 10 by me and anybody else, but please can I ask him to wait for the inquiry to conclude.
Andrew Lower.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently attended a debate held by my honourable friend for West Aberdeenshire and Kincardine, seeking a central London memorial for the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit. And in it I referenced my Northampton South constituent, mosquito pilot, Mr. George Pritchard, who is 98 next week and is one of the last surviving members of the unit. Will the Prime Minister join my honourable friend, me and Mr. Pritchard in backing this fitting and needed memorial?
I thank him very much, and I will certainly do what I can to support it, though, of course, as he knows, the memorial to George Pritchard, though, as he knows, this is a matter for local authorities. What this House and what this government can certainly do is ensure that memorials are not desecrated, as they have been across this country, and make sure that we support legislation that penalises those who indulge in such desecration.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when a Prime Minister is spending his time trying to convince the great British public that he's actually stupid rather than dishonest, isn't it time that he goes now?
Mr. Speaker, I think that was a question for you rather than me, but I'm not. Look, I've made my point. I think that the British public have responded to what this government has had to say in the most eloquent way possible. They have beaten COVID so far, Mr. Speaker. They have helped to defeat COVID so far, Mr. Speaker, with the steps they have taken by getting vaccinated and implementing Plan B, and I thank them.
Just for the Prime Minister, for the record, it's not Speaker's questions. Sir Robert Goodall.
Our armed forces have earned the respect and admiration of our nation, not least during the pandemic. On Remembrance Sunday, we commemorate their sacrifices, but on Armed Forces Day, on the 25th of June, we will celebrate all that is amazing about our Army, Navy and Air Force. In a normal year, we get about 20,000 people at the event in Scarborough, but this year we will finally host, after twice being postponed, National Armed Forces Day. Will the Prime Minister pull out all the stops on land, sea and air to make this truly an event to remember?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have no doubt that Armed Forces Day will be absolutely spectacular across the country, and that Scarborough will make a terrific contribution and a notable contribution as well.
Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last April, I asked the Prime Minister if he agreed with the principle that politicians shouldn't lie. He replied that he concurred with the basic principle that the honourable gentleman has just enunciated. Would he like to amend the record?
No, Mr. Speaker.
Simon Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The vast majority of people, and indeed politicians across Northern Ireland, believe that whatever the question, double jobbing is not the answer. Could I urge my right honourable friend to listen to the majority and ask him not to move the government amendment in the other place later today?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I'm advised that I think the amendment in question is indeed going to be withdrawn.
Twist.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents are rightly angry at the Prime Minister's behaviour. But while Downing Street fights to save his political life, people across the North East are worrying about rising food and energy bills, rising unemployment and rising levels of child poverty. He talks about levelling up, but my constituents are seeing opportunities cut. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that his government has failed and it's time for him to go?
No, Mr. Speaker, I really don't agree with her, and I don't think she could have been following anything that's being said this afternoon. We have unemployment falling to near record lows, Mr. Speaker, and we have job vacancies. We have job vacancies at record highs, Mr. Speaker. That's what Conservative governments do. They create jobs and they get the economy moving.
David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many on these benches, I spent weeks and months defending the Prime Minister against often angry constituents. I've reminded them of his success in delivering Brexit and on the vaccine and many other things. But I expect my leaders to shoulder the responsibility for the actions they take. Yesterday, he did the opposite of that. So I'll remind him of a quotation altogether too familiar to him, of Leo Amery to Neville Chamberlain. You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
Order. Prime Minister.
I must say to the right honourable gentleman, I don't know what he's talking about, but what I can tell him, I don't know what quotation he's alluding to that he's referring. But what I can tell him is that I think I've told this House repeatedly throughout this pandemic, I take full responsibility for everything done in this government and throughout the pandemic.
Stephen Kinnock.
Does the Prime Minister agree with the Leader of the House that the Leader of the Scottish Conservatives is a lightweight?
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative approach to the Union is one that I think is right for our country. We want to keep it together, and I think Conservatives in Scotland do an excellent job, and that's why their stout defiance, their stout defence of the Union was repaid at the last election, and Labour, Mr. Speaker, is increasingly endangering our unions.
Clayton Drummond.
Mr. Speaker, and many people last week welcomed the 5-year moratorium on smart motorways. However, the M27 is due to be open as a smart motorway in a couple of months. What reassurance can my right honourable friend give my constituents in Meon Valley and others in the rest of South Hampshire that the M27 will be safe and give them confidence to use it?
I thank her very much, and I can assure her that we're well aware of the risks associated with the smart motorway scheme. I know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, is looking at it right now.
We now come to the Prime Minister's COVID-19 statement. I now call the Prime Minister.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will make a statement on our progress against Omicron.
Prime Minister, just let the room clear a little bit. Order. Can we please leave quickly and quietly? What a day. Prime Minister, please.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will make a statement on our progress against Omicron and the review of our Plan B measures. Within hours of learning from scientists in South Africa about the emergence of a new COVID variant last November, this government acted, introducing balanced and proportionate restrictions at our borders to slow the seeding of Omicron in our country. As we learned more about this highly transmissible new variant, we implemented the Plan B measures we had prepared precisely in case our situation deteriorated, encouraging people to change their behaviour to slow the spread of the virus and buying crucial time to get boosters into arms. We made the big call to refocus our National Health Service, necessarily requiring the difficult postponement of many other appointments so that we could double the speed of the booster programme. And thanks to the extraordinary efforts of our NHS and its volunteers, we delivered the fastest booster programme in Europe, reaching half our population before any other European country, with more than 36 million boosters now in arms across the UK, including more than 90% of all over 60s in England. And taking a balanced approach, we resisted calls from others to shut down our country all over again. Many nations across Europe have endured further winter lockdowns. Many have seen hospitality curfews and nightclubs closed, capacity limits at sports stadiums, the return of social distancing, and in some places, Christmas and New Year as good as cancelled. But this government took a different path. We kept England open, and we supported those businesses which faced reduced demand because of the response to Plan B measures. And while we must continue to remain cautious, the data are showing that time and again this government got the toughest decisions right. Today's latest ONS data show clearly that infection levels are falling in England, and while there are some places where cases are likely to continue rising, including in primary schools, our scientists believe it is likely that the Omicron wave has now peaked nationally. There remain, of course, significant pressures on the NHS across our country, and especially in the North East and North West. But hospital admissions, which were doubling every 9 days just 2 weeks ago, have now stabilised, with admissions in London even falling, and the numbers in intensive care not only remain low, but are actually also falling. So, this morning, the Cabinet concluded that because of the extraordinary booster campaign, together with the way the public have responded to the Plan B measures, we can return to Plan A in England and allow Plan B regulations to expire. As a result, from the start of Thursday next week, mandatory certification will end. Organisations can, of course, choose to use the NHS code, no longer asking people to work from home. And people should now speak to their employers about arrangements for returning to the office. And having looked at the data carefully, the Cabinet concluded that once regulations lapse, the government will no longer mandate the wearing of face masks anywhere. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, from tomorrow we will no longer require face masks in classrooms, and the Department for Education will shortly remove national guidance on their use in communal areas. In the country at large, we will continue to suggest the use of face coverings in enclosed or crowded spaces, particularly when you come into contact with people you don't normally meet, but we will trust the judgment of the British people and no longer criminalise anyone who chooses not to wear one. The government will also ease restrictions further on visits to care homes, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, will set out plans in the coming days. Mr. Speaker, as we return to Plan A, the House will know that some measures still remain, including those on self-isolation. In particular, it is still a legal requirement for those who have tested positive for COVID to self-isolate. On Monday, we reduced the isolation period to 5 full days with 2 negative tests, And there will soon come a time when we can remove the legal requirement to self-isolate altogether, just as we don't place legal obligations on people to isolate if they have flu. As COVID becomes endemic, we will need to replace legal requirements with advice and guidance, urging people with the virus to be careful and considerate of others. The self-isolation regulations expire on the 24th of March, at which point I very much expect not to renew them. Indeed, were the data to allow, I would like to seek a vote in this House to bring that date forwards. In advance of that, we will set out our long-term strategy for living with COVID-19, explaining how we hope and intend to protect our liberty and avoid restrictions in future by relying instead on medical advances, especially the vaccines, which have already saved so many lives. But to make that possible, we must all remain cautious during these last weeks of winter. When there are still over 16,000 people in hospital in England alone, the pandemic is not over. And Mr. Speaker, make no mistake, Omicron is not a mild disease for everyone, especially if you're not vaccinated. Just look at the numbers in intensive care in other countries where vaccination rates are far lower. Indeed, from our NHS data, we know that around 90% of people in intensive care are not boosted. So I urge members across the House to do everything possible to encourage any remaining constituents who have not done so to get boosted now. And for the next few weeks, I encourage everyone across the country to continue with the behaviours that we know help to keep everybody safe. Washing hands, letting fresh air in, getting tested, self-isolating if positive, and, as I say, thinking about wearing a face covering in crowded and enclosed settings. Mr. Speaker, Omicron tested us just as Alpha and Delta did before. But let's remember some of what we've achieved. We were the first nation in the world to administer a vaccine. We were the fastest in Europe to roll it out, because outside the European Medicines Agency, this government made the big call to pursue our own British procurement strategy rather than opting back into the EU scheme as some people urged. We created a world-beating testing programme, the largest in Europe, Mr. Speaker, and procured the most antivirals of any country in Europe too, because this government made the big call to invest early in lateral flow tests and in cutting-edge drugs to protect the most vulnerable. We've delivered the fastest booster campaign in Europe, and we are the first to emerge from the Omicron wave, because the government made the big call to focus on our NHS and to refocus our activity and lead that campaign to get boosted now. And that's why we've retained the most open economy and society anywhere across the European continent and the fastest growing economy in the G7. Because we made that tough decision to open up last summer when others said that we shouldn't, and to keep things open over the winter when others wanted them shut, Mr. Speaker. This week, the World Health Organization said that while the global situation remains challenging, the United Kingdom can start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And, Mr. Speaker, this is no accident of history. Exactly. Confronted by the nation's biggest challenge since the Second World War and the worst pandemic since 1918, any government would get some things wrong, but this government got the big things right, Mr. Speaker, and I commend this statement to the House.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement. Throughout the pandemic, the British public have made enormous sacrifices to limit the spread of the virus, staying at home, social distancing, and, unlike the Prime Minister, cancelling parties. I would like to thank everybody who has followed the rules. I'd like to thank the NHS staff and volunteers who've rolled out the booster jab. The Labour Party does not want to see restrictions in place any longer than necessary. We will support the relaxation of Plan B as long as the science says that it is safe. So can the Prime Minister share the scientific evidence behind his decision and reassure the public that he's acting to protect their health, not just his job? The 438 deaths recorded yesterday are a solemn reminder that this pandemic is not over. We need to remain vigilant, learn the lessons from the government's mistakes. With new variants highly likely, we must have a robust plan to live well with COVID. So where is it? He's too distracted to do the job. And it's not just the Prime Minister who's letting us down. Where's the Health Secretary's plan to prepare for another wave of infections? Why isn't the Chancellor working with British manufacturers to shore up our domestic supplies of tests? Where is the Foreign Secretary's plan to help vaccinate the world? They're all too busy plotting their leadership campaigns to keep the public safe. While the Conservative Party tear themselves apart, jostling for position, looking inward, the Labour Party is focused on the national interest, filling their void. We have a plan that the Prime Minister doesn't. We would train and retain a reserve army of volunteer vaccinators. We will build a supply of test kits made in Britain to protect us from global shortages. We would raise statutory sick pay and make all workers eligible, keep schools open by improving ventilation, break the endless cycle of new variants by playing our part in vaccinating the world. We would produce a roadmap for decision-making to ensure efficient action when it's demanded. We'd stop the short-sighted sell-off of the UK's vaccine manufacturing centre, and we would never again allow our NHS and social care service to be so run down and underfunded, understaffed and overstretched as it has been over the last decade of a Tory government. Mr. Speaker, Labour has a plan to live well with COVID and secure our lives, livelihoods and liberties. Where's his?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd be happy to share the scientific advice on which we've taken this decision, of course, and he can see it's there for everybody to consult. But he asks about our testing abilities, Mr. Speaker. We're conducting about 1.25 million tests a day. We have the biggest capability to do tests of any country in Europe. We've built, as I promised the House, Mr. Speaker, and he attacked me at the time, I said, well, we have a world-beating testing industry, a massive diagnostics facility, which we never had before. He attacks the government over the distribution of vaccines to the rest of the world. We've already done 30 million. We'll do 100 million by June, Mr. Speaker, and 2.5 billion AstraZeneca vaccines have been distributed around the world, thanks to the deal the UK government did with AstraZeneca, so that those vaccines are distributed at cost price. He talks about funding the NHS. That party, Mr. Speaker, voted against the funding that we're going to need to clear the COVID backlogs and fund our NHS. Mr. Speaker, throughout this pandemic, he has been absolutely shameless in veering from one position to the next, and he has been wrong. He has been wrong about virtually every single important decision. He was wrong about keeping schools open, Mr. Speaker. Do you remember he consistently refused to say that they were safe because of what his paymasters in the union were telling him? He was wrong about going forward from lockdown in July, on July the 19th. He said it was reckless. Do you remember, Mr. Speaker? He was totally wrong. He was wrong about, the Labour front bench were wrong about going through Christmas and New Year with Plan B, as we did. They said we needed a roadmap back to lockdown. He did. That guy did. Oh no, wait, it was Ashwin. Maybe it was you. That guy. They said they wanted a roadmap back to lockdown, Mr. Speaker. At every step, and above all, Mr. Speaker, they tried to undermine the vaccine task force and to say that you could not spend money. They said you should not be spending £675,000 of taxpayers' money on outreach to vaccine-hesitant groups. That's their idea of priority spending, Mr. Speaker. He has been, it's been absolutely miserable listening to the opposite bench because they have had nothing useful to say. They have flip-flopped opportunistically from one position to the other. And, Mr. Speaker, did you get any idea from what he said just now whether or not he supports what we're doing? No. So he does support it. Okay, he supports it this week, Mr. Speaker. But what you can be certain of, Mr. Speaker, is that if he thinks that there's any political opportunity in opposing it next week, he won't hesitate to do so. He's been capped in hindsight throughout, Mr. Speaker. Captain Hindsight, and he's had absolutely nothing useful to say or to contribute.
Lisa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I refer the House to my entry in the Members' Register. Can I say to my right honourable friend that many of my constituents work in the aviation sector? I welcome the announcement he's made about Plan B restrictions today, but I note he made no reference to the tests that are still required for people coming into England. If we're going to learn to live with COVID, we need to facilitate travel. So will he take this opportunity to announce that when Plan B restrictions are removed next week, the government also make it clear that there will be no test requirements for anybody entering England who is fully vaccinated?
I thank my right honourable friend. We're certainly reviewing the testing arrangements for travel, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, will be making a statement in the next few days on that, Mr. Speaker. But I think it's very important that everybody in the country understands that getting your booster, wherever you want to go in the world, getting your booster is going to be a pretty crucial thing to do.
We now come to Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement. We're all grateful that the data suggests that we've turned a corner in the Omicron wave, and that the success of the vaccination programme in particular gives us cause to be hopeful in the months ahead. But though declining, the level of infection is still undoubtedly high, and the NHS remains under pressure. That is why caution is the key, rather than the PM strategy of throwing caution to the wind. Baseline measures of face coverings and indoor public places and working from home where possible, which Scotland still has in place throughout, are extremely important in the weeks ahead, as is the guidance on lateral flow test. So will the Prime Minister guarantee, and maybe if he can come off his phone because this is important, so will the Prime Minister guarantee that lateral flow tests will remain free as they are required, and put to bed speculation that they will be removed free at the point of need? But, Mr. Speaker, while the data gives us cause to be optimistic, the real problem for the Prime Minister is that no matter what the data has said today, he had no choice but to throw caution to the wind. The pathetic and unbelievable excuses that he doesn't know his own rules have left the Prime Minister weak. The Prime Minister is unable to lead on this issue or on any other, and the public can't trust a single word that the Prime Minister says. Any shred of credibility has gone. In a global pandemic, which is what the World Health Organization is cautioning, is nowhere near over, and during which new variants are likely to emerge, it is deeply concerning that we have a Prime Minister like this at the helm who simply is not fit to lead. And even though, thankfully, the figures give us cause to be hopeful, it's clear that the Prime Minister cannot carry on when his credibility has all gone.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I repeat the points I made earlier on to the right honourable gentleman, and I think that the whole effort, the reason we're in the state that we are, is because of the immense cooperation there's been across the whole of the UK. He talks about testing, and of course we'll keep lateral flow tests free for as long as is necessary. But testing has been a fantastic example of union collaboration. I've seen for myself tests being being assessed in Glasgow that were coming from people in Sussex. It's been I've seen the work of the UK Armed Services helping people across the whole of the UK to move people who needed treatment to wherever. It has been a fantastic example of union collaboration. I hope he bears that in mind.
Absolutely. We now come to the Chair of the Select Committee, Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the height of the first wave, this government had the courage to pre-order 400 million doses of vaccine without even knowing if they worked, and that has laid the foundations for us having the best vaccine programme of any large country. So I welcome today's announcement. It won't surprise the Prime Minister, though, if I draw his attention to the fact that NHS doctors and nurses are absolutely shattered. He will have seen this week that 1 in 6 doctors say that they have had near misses or harmed patients because of exhaustion. So if he doesn't want to accept the Select Committee's recommendations to address the workforce crisis, what will he do to give hope to our brilliant frontline staff?
First of all, Mr. Speaker, I want to, my right honourable friend has a great deal of expertise in this matter. I want to thank everybody in the NHS, all staff, frontline and all staff for what they've been doing. And I know he's right of what he says about how tired people are. They're exhausted, Mr. Speaker, but they're also working heroically and doing an incredible job. And it's because there are 17,000 COVID cases that, as I said, we've got to remain cautious. In spite of what the general opposite was saying, we do need to remain cautious, and we need to make sure that we continue to recruit for our amazing NHS. There are now 44,000 more healthcare professionals, Mr. Speaker, than there were in 2020, and that's as a result of the recruitment by this government.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that the vaccine still remains one of the best defences against this virus, but over the past month we have seen a slowing in the booster vaccination rate. So can the Prime Minister update the House as to when he expects a completion date for the booster vaccination, but also can he set out a plan as to how he is going to encourage take-up of the vaccination among certain groups, particularly young people?
Prime Minister, she makes an incredibly important point, and I'm grateful to her, because there is a job of work for all of us to do in reaching out to groups who and it's, at the moment it's not actually hesitancy, it's more apathy that's the problem. It's because Omicron is seen wrongly to be a mild disease, that people are not getting the vaccine in the way that they might. And we need to break down that apathy with those groups, and we're doing everything we can to do that. The numbers are rising the whole time, but we want them to rise faster.
Andrew Lutz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You would think that today of all days, opposition benches could be delighted for our great United Kingdom. Delighted that legal restrictions could come to an end soon. Delighted about the amazing vaccine rollout, and delighted about the strength of our economy. All a superb team effort led by my right honourable friend. But can he reassure me that in the work that looks post-fact, that he will very carefully assess the lockdown impact on people having babies, and in particular those who are separated from their partners, who are unable to take part in the birth experience with them, which is so vital for giving every baby the best start for life.
Prime Minister.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for what she has just said, and her point about birth partners being able to attend is unbelievably important, and I'm glad that we were able to address it in spite of some difficulties. And her Early Start for Life programme is unbelievably important, and I know that both my right honourable friend for education and for health are working with her to deliver it.
Dave.
Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister had to accept that he was unaware of what his own COVID rules actually allowed. With millions of British people now seeing that the Prime Minister can't even grasp what his own basic rules are, he's no longer a credible person to set the rules for others during this public health crisis. Isn't it time he accepted that the House and the country can no longer trust him with the nation's health? And the best policy to beat COVID now will be for him to resign.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, ni hao, as we say to the right honourable gentleman. 人心里很高兴。Mr. Speaker, I don't agree with him. I want to go on and deliver on the people's priorities. This government was elected with an enormous mandate to unite and level up across our country, and that is what we're going to do.
Mark Harper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hope the Prime Minister will forgive me for not being extraordinarily grateful for the withdrawal of these measures. I and many colleagues on these benches didn't think they were necessary in December, but I do nonetheless welcome their removal. Can I draw his attention to a further policy which I think it would be helpful if he reconsidered? The government's current plan is to say to our valuable NHS staff that if they refuse to be vaccinated, they're to be sacked. And those sackings are to commence in a couple of weeks' time with no compensation. We know, and we know now, that the Secretary of State is being advised by his own officials due to the lack of protection against transmission, that this needs to be rethought. Can I urge the Prime Minister to rethink this policy? We shouldn't reward our NHS staff for all their dedication with the sack. We should allow them to continue in the valuable work that they deliver to our great country.
Minister.
I thank him very much, and I respect very much the points of view that he's put across consistently throughout this pandemic. And it's been very important that we've had a voice speaking up for freedom in the way that he has. But I have to think also of those who will be at the bedside of elderly and vulnerable people who are dying of nosocomially acquired COVID, and their feelings about our failure to get vaccination rates up high enough within the NHS. And it's a very, very grim problems. I'm sure he can understand, Mr. Speaker. And nobody wants to have compulsory vaccination, but since the policy was announced, rates of vaccination within the NHS have gone up notably, and that's a positive thing. We will reflect on the way ahead. We don't want to drive people out of the service, but it is a professional responsibility of everybody looking after the health of others within our NHS to get vaccinated, and I hope he agrees with that.
Wayne David.
Does the Prime Minister agree with me? But unlike someone who attended bring your own booze parties, the Welsh First Minister Mark Drakeford has behaved with decency and integrity throughout this entire pandemic.
It's certainly been, I think the collaboration across England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland has been exemplary, and I've enjoyed working with our partners and will continue to do so.
Edward Tibbs.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I refer honourable members to my entry in the register. And can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement today, and particularly the decision to now remove face masks from schools. I know many children and staff, pupils and parents will be extremely pleased that is now happening. But I know he will also share my concern, and that of the Children's Commissioner, Dame Rachel de Souza, that during the pandemic we've seen many thousands of children who have become off the radar of schools, off school rolls. And particularly the most vulnerable children, this causes serious problems about their exposure to crime and exploitation. So will he look again at some of the recommendations in my review of school exclusion to try and address this, so that we can track every pupil who is of a school age? Because we should have as a basic principle knowing that every child is in school, where they're in school, and what their future is to be.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is an expert in this, and he's spot on in what he says. I don't want to see excluded kids being locked in on a cycle of ever-growing deprivation. He's absolutely right. The best place for kids is in school. That's why we worked so hard to keep schools open and to insist that they were safe.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was listening carefully to the Prime Minister's statement. I don't think he mentioned long COVID once. Yet, according to the ONS, over 1 million people are living with this debilitating condition. Yesterday, the all-party group on coronavirus heard heartbreaking testimony from frontline NHS workers who are living with long COVID and many of whom cannot return to work because of this condition. Will he now commit to formally recognising long COVID as an occupational disease and launch a compensation scheme for frontline workers who are left unable to work after catching COVID whilst on the front line of our pandemic response?
Prime Minister.
I thank, and I really understand the concerns of people with long COVID. Everybody knows people who've had an experience with COVID that has gone on far longer than many others, and who've had a genuinely debilitating time. And we are looking at it. The research continues, and we will do whatever we can to support people with long COVID. But there's a deal of work still to be done.
Let's have the most exciting man, Sir Desmond Swain.
Thank you. Can I welcome wholeheartedly the announcements that have been made today? And I would ask the Prime Minister to review again the need to sack domiciliary workers and NHS workers, and to examine that evidence that suggests that they pose a risk to their statements, when our belief is that they won't any more than unvaccinated.
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, but I think the evidence is clear that healthcare professionals should get vaccinated.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The rush to remove the requirement for masks, including on public transport, will cause people to fall ill and die unnecessarily. Isn't this all about saving the Prime Minister's political skin, not about protecting public health? What a moral failure and what a bad way to go.
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I notice that he's at variance with his front bench on that point, not for the first time. I don't think he's right. I think we should trust to the judgment of the British people, and that's what we're going to do.
Mr. Mac.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too want to welcome today's statement and the review of the Plan B measures. And like colleagues here on this side of the House, I too want to question on behalf of the 100,000 NHS workers the mandatory vaccination. Given the Chief Medical Officer told MPs that vaccinations had a minimal impact on transmission, isn't it the case now there is no reason at all for mandatory vaccinations for care workers and NHS staff? Over the last 2 years, these people have worked tirelessly on the front line, and we have clapped these key workers. Can the Prime Minister now make sure that he doesn't sack them? It is utterly unjustifiable.
Prime Minister.
I understand her point, but I must say that the NHS fully supports the policy because of out of considerations for patient safety. And I would just repeat what I've said to several members. I really think it's the duty of healthcare professionals to get vaccinated.
Adam Keza.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After he called for the Prime Minister's resignation over Partygate, the branch manager of the Scottish Conservatives was referred to as a lightweight by the Leader of the House. I simply ask, how does the Prime Minister think he can maintain his position and continue to issue rules and advice on COVID when he can't follow the rules himself?
At some point you do.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't agree with her with the greatest respect, and she will have to wait to see whenever the inquiry concludes. But Mr. Speaker, I think that the work on rules and guidance, which we've done together with our friends and partners in the Scottish administration, has been exemplary, and it's helped this whole country to come out of COVID faster than any other European country.
Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's statement today, particularly about masks, and I hope they never ever return in our schools. But sadly, it felt to many of us that were concerned about the Plan B measures that there was no learning from the last 2 years, and we've had the impact on businesses, including my beloved wedding sector, has been quite serious, with fears about the next winter already affecting bookings. Will my right honourable friend confirm that we're learning from facts and not just models to give confidence that our response to the next variant, because it will come, will be assessed accordingly?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and if she wants to look at other European countries, and I share her enthusiasm for the weddings industry and business. It's a fantastically important business and a massive employer in our country. But other European countries, I hesitate to make this point again, Mr. Speaker, have been in a far worse state when it comes to the closures and the restrictions they've been forced to impose. I'm thrilled that we've been able to open up in the way that we have and get people married in the style and pomp that they want.
Murray Rimmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Prime Minister, there is a group of vulnerable people who are not able to receive the booster. They've inquired through the CCGs, the doctors, NHS England. There is a blockage in the system. They've had 3 injections, but the 3rd one doesn't count as a booster. And they were told they'd get the 4th, but they cannot access it. Please intervene and get people talking to unblock this.
Prime Minister.
I thank her very much, and we're working fast to unblock it so that the people get the 4th jab as fast as possible.
David Johnston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's statement today? Can I ask him if he will not just remove the work from home guidance, but actively encourage people to return to the office? Because it's not just good for the economy, it's particularly important for younger workers who can't get the skills, experience and networks they need by working from home.
Prime Minister.
Yes. Well, Mr. Speaker, I do agree with that, and I think that actually across Whitehall we need to show a lead and make sure that we get back to work, everybody gets back to work. It is safe to do so, provided everybody exercises the due caution that I've set out today. But I entirely agree with my honourable friend.
Mick Whittle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are mercifully in a much better position today than we were this time a year ago, and that's thanks to the heroic efforts of the NHS in roll-out vaccinations. But just 9% of people living in Africa have been vaccinated against COVID-19 to date. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the UK is failing to honour its humanitarian obligations to the poorest countries in the world, and will he commit his government to supporting a waiver of intellectual property rights on COVID-19 vaccines?
Prime Minister.
I agree with him, Mr. Speaker, about the importance of vaccinating the world. No one's safe till everybody's safe. That is clear. And we must get more vaccines to Africa in particular. I've talked to colleagues in African governments, African leaders, about what we can do to have more fill and finish in Africa, what we can do to encourage Africa's own supply of vaccination. Now, that's the best long-term answer. But what we need to do in the meantime is donate our vaccines, which is what we're doing. The UK is donating 100 million, as I told the House earlier, by June, but also to continue the rollout of the AstraZeneca jab, which, don't forget, has basically been underwritten by the British state in the sense that it is delivered at cost, thanks to the deal that we did. And that's in addition to the £548 million that we've given to COVAX and the investment in Gavi as well. So the UK, I think, has a proud record on vaccinating the world, but there is clearly much, much more that the world needs to do, and I agree with him about that.
Right.
Welcome for the return to Plan A from me, Mr. Speaker. I hope it is irreversible this time. Now, the Prime Minister knows our young people have missed out on so much, and now they face punishment for doing the right thing when it comes to travel, especially our teenagers. They cannot prove, Prime Minister, that they've had 2 jabs on the NHS app if they're under 16 because they can't access it. Even if they can access a sort of cumbersome process involving a letter from the NHS, those with 1 jab and a recent infection, they cannot prove that at all. That effectively grounds them. Now, Prime Minister, half-term is coming. Family memories are now and not at some point in the future. Please, can we urgently, with the Health Secretary sitting next to him, find a way that teenagers are treated with fairness and parity with their parents on these important issues so they can get on with their lives with their families?
Minister.
Yeah, my honourable friend makes an extremely important point about young people and vaccination. I do think that people need to appreciate the value of vaccination for ease of travel, particularly boosters, but it should be as simple as possible for young people. I totally agree with him about that, and I know that my right honourable friend will make a statement in the next few days about what we propose to do.
Ely.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to quote the words of my constituent Stephen Booth, who says, "I wish to add my name to the angry voices regarding the conduct of politicians who broke the rules during lockdown, but especially that of the Prime Minister, who demanded we follow the rules, which we did to the letter, whilst completely disregarding the rules themselves. This is one scandal too many. Mr. Booth and other constituents will now have no confidence in the rules or the public health messaging from this Prime Minister, and that is a serious failing. What is the Prime Minister's response to my constituents?"
Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful to your constituent for his point of view, but I think and I understand where he's coming from, but if you look at the evidence, the UK population has been amazing in the way that we have followed the guidance, followed the rules, and the results are there to be seen in what I've been able to announce today.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I warmly welcome the lifting of the restrictions and congratulate everyone involved in the booster vaccine rollout. Mental health services in Rushcliffe have seen a huge spike in demand following the pandemic. Can my right honourable friend reassure me that mental health services will have their share of the billions of pounds of catch-up funding which this Conservative government has awarded to the NHS and which the party opposite voted against?
I thank my honourable friend, and she is totally right. I believe the #1 priority now for the British people is not just to keep our economy moving forwards in the way that we are, but to make sure that we clear those COVID backlogs. And you can't do it, Mr. Speaker, without the steps that the government has taken. I thought it was amazing that the party opposite voted against them.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I have confirmation from the Prime Minister? Is he getting rid of the COVID rules simply because he doesn't understand them?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're able to make progress on the COVID rules and to get rid of them because of our deep understanding of the pandemic, and I thank him and I thank all our Scottish colleagues for the way they've helped to communicate what we're doing in such a way the British people across the whole of the UK has been able to move forward more or less together, so that the differences between us are far smaller than the similarities, and I'm very proud of that.
Mr. Edmund-Lee. Only this morning I received an email on behalf of deaf pupils who have been so disadvantaged by forced mask wearing in schools. But for this Prime Minister, we would have had far more severe lockdowns and restrictions. So may I say to him, please, Prime Minister, remain true to your instincts. Please sweep away all these remaining controls like isolation, which are crippling the NHS. And may I say to him, lastly, to paraphrase Leo Amery, for God's sake, keep going.
Thank you. Well, that's right. I haven't sat here quite long enough or indeed nothing like long enough in my view. But Mr. Speaker, yes, I think he's quite right about schools, and it is incredible. It is very important to keep them going, but also I think that masks do erode our ability to educate properly, to learn properly, and I'm glad that they're going.
Emma Lulbert.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today, the Department for Health and Social Care, the Royal College of Nursing and others have rightly raised concerns regarding what they refer to as the rationality, proportionality and recklessness of mandatory vaccination for NHS staff. With approximately 100,000 vacancies already, does the Prime Minister think that come April, sacking over 70,000 NHS staff will increase or decrease the pressures on our NHS?
Prime Minister.
I hear her point, and many other colleagues have made this point today. And I'm glad that the numbers are going up. But actually, her front bench doesn't agree with her. They do agree with the policy that we've, as far as I understand their position. I just repeat, I do think it is the duty of healthcare professionals to get vaccinated.
Miriam Cates.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am absolutely delighted with my right honourable friend's announcement that children will no longer be required to wear masks in schools. And it's a welcome and evidence-based return to prioritising the interests of our children, who have suffered greatly during the pandemic. My right honourable friend knows that I haven't always been a supporter of restrictions, but does he agree with me that under a Labour government, far from being the freest country in Europe, we would have had longer, harder lockdowns and school closures, causing immeasurably more harm to the poorest, the youngest and the most vulnerable in our society?
Speaker, I see the gentleman on the opposite front bench shaking his head. He was cruelly exposed last week for the way he called repeatedly for lockdown, Mr. Speaker, and that is the reality. No, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that they would have kept us in lockdown in July, and their response to Omicron was to call for a roadmap back into lockdown. And she is totally right, Mr. Speaker.
Calvin Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Birmingham, we've been trying to tackle areas of low vaccine take-up, and it's been difficult to do that. When we go to people now, they are saying if these rules aren't good enough for the Prime Minister, if they're not good enough for Downing Street, and this Prime Minister couldn't tell the truth if his life depended on it, what would I say now to my constituents now to ensure that to have that take-up of vaccine?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, vote Conservative, obviously, but get boosted now, is what I would say.
Jenkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for standing firm immediately before Christmas in the face of much pressure from the opposition for further restrictions and to effectively cancel Christmas. It's due to his instincts that we're the freest country in the Western world and we're the one leading the way in showing the rest of the world how to live with COVID. Throughout the pandemic, we've had masks in schools in Cumbria, even when the guidance did not recommend them, to no effect on case rates when kids started mixing again. And in fact, as proven by the Leader of the Opposition, who has been struck down by COVID a number of times, despite allegedly wearing his mask. Can my right honourable friend confirm to me that the guidance will go further than not just requiring, but will remove masks, the option for masks in schools completely?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend, who is a fantastic campaigner for Workington and for liberty, Mr. Speaker, and he's absolutely right about what he says about masks in education. I'm delighted they're going, and we will make sure. I think we need to work together to ensure that we have a way of living with COVID that ensures they never, ever come back.
Neil Hanby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Early in the pandemic, the government banged the fist on the table and demanded that the UK diagnostic sector respond to the challenge ahead. The industry responded, and their reward was to be ignored and sidelined, because contracts there came none. 2 weeks ago, the UK diagnostics industry looked on in disbelief as the PM bragged about government support for manufacturing for lateral flow devices. Yesterday, the Secretary of State bragged about buying UK-manufactured lateral flow devices. I could ask the Prime Minister how many UK-manufactured lateral flow devices his government have purchased, but I don't need to, because the answer is none. Why is the Prime Minister trying to hide his government's undermining of the UK domestic diagnostic sector?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is completely wrong, and he should go to Nottingham, where he'll find a factory called Shorescreen, which makes lateral flow kits, and we have bought millions and millions of them, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah. Philip Oliver.
Can I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's lifting of the COVID restrictions? At the present time, 70% of those in Kettering General Hospital with COVID are unvaccinated, and the vast majority of those could have had the vaccine but made the wrong choice in not doing so. Can I urge the Prime Minister, when the daily hospitalisation cases are published, to emphasise the fact that the vast majority are unvaccinated as an incentive to get those more boosters done?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I thank him. He's spot on. He's absolutely right in what he says, and I've tried to draw repeated attention, Mr. Speaker, in what I've been saying, to the sad fact that 90% of people in ICU have had no booster, Mr. Speaker, and I think 66% of people have had are unvaccinated at all. Omicron is not a mild disease for everyone, and it can be particularly nasty if you're not vaccinated.
Ray Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do acknowledge the enormous effort that the NHS has made, that the Prime Minister referred to the many thousands of people who've been treated. But can I also point out that the cost to 50,000 cancer patients of delayed diagnosis? His colleague, sitting alongside him, the Health Secretary, in this very chamber said, it is this government's intention to wage a war on cancer, a statement welcomed by the Catch Up with Cancer campaign. But may I respectfully remind the Prime Minister, unless this rhetoric is backed up by a plan, by new resources to address the workforce crisis, new IT networks and new equipment, then it'll just be seen as empty rhetoric.
Minister.
But I thank him. I agree with him completely. And tackling the cancer backlog is a massive priority for the government. It's not just a question of making sure people have access to the right drugs. The delays are very largely caused by delays in diagnostics, by scans, by screens, as he knows. That's one of the biggest problems we've got. That's why since October, we've rolled out 40 community diagnostics hubs, and they'll be part of a total of 100 100 going forward. We want to see many more, much more rapid diagnosis to help contract those periods that people are now spending on the waiting list, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw attention to my entry in the register. The Prime Minister made the right call on restrictions before Christmas, and he's made the right call today, except in one respect, and that is the compulsory vaccination of NHS workers. Given that leaked advice to ministers has said that that is neither rational nor proportionate, given what we now know about Omicron and its behaviour, will he think again before redundancy letters start going out as from the 3rd of February?
Prime Minister. Yes, Mr. Speaker, the argument has been well made by colleagues across the House today. I just remind my right honourable friend, this is something that is supported by the NHS themselves for patient safety. It's a very difficult point when it comes to patients who have contracted fatal nosocomial COVID, nosocomially acquired COVID. People do want their medical staff to be vaccinated. I would just repeat what I've said throughout the afternoon. I do think it's the responsibility of all healthcare professionals to be vaccinated, and I hope that's a view that he shares as well.
Janet Day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Parents and carers are concerned about their child's safety and protection from the virus. Ventilators are proven to work to reduce the spread of the virus, and I'm aware that the government has provided a fraction of ventilators to schools. But can the Prime Minister confirm and say when ventilators will be provided in schools up and down our country, all schools up and down our country?
Yes,
Prime Minister.
I thank her very much. Yes, from memory, Mr. Speaker, we've supplied 350,000 CO2 detectors, and we're also supplying, I think we're supplying 7,000 ventilators, Mr. Speaker. I realise that doesn't cover every school in the country, but on the other hand, not every school in the country does have a severe problem with it, and many schools are dealing with it, in my experience, with a great deal of practicality and common sense.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I too welcome the Prime Minister's statement? Can he reassure my vulnerable constituents that the move and the general government approach to COVID is based on the trends in data, and that despite some still very high case rates, the risk of serious disease faced by a double-vaxxed and boosted individual is very low, and that they should continue to live their lives to the full along with the rest of us?
Prime Minister.
Yes, yes, Mr. Speaker. I think my honourable friend is completely right, and I think that COVID has caused a great deal of apprehension across the country, particularly amongst vulnerable people, in my experience. And it is important, as we go forward and we recover our freedoms, that they in particular regain the confidence to live their lives to the full, as we would all want.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following the Department of Health's discussions with the Information Commissioner, is the Prime Minister satisfied that NHS employers will have access to all the information they require in order to ensure that all of their staff have indeed been vaccinated?
Prime Minister.
Yes. The right honourable gentleman makes an extremely important point. The data I have at the moment is that it's up to 94.7%, I believe, of NHS staff who have been vaccinated. That's a great improvement, but we've got to make sure that we cull all the data as fast as possible, and we work with all the NHS trusts to get that data as fast as possible. I think one of the big things we've learnt in this pandemic is that data needs to be much more accessible, faster to the Department of Health.
Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Had we listened to the opposition, it would have had a catastrophic effect prior to Christmas with the restrictions that the shadow member was asking for. Thank goodness we have this Prime Minister that's done the right thing. Can I quickly ask the Prime Minister about the Fielding Palmer Hospital in Lutterworth? Can I ask him if he can help me arrange an urgent meeting with his colleague, the Secretary of State for Health, to discuss the important future of that hospital, which has been used as a COVID vaccination centre?
You bet, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Ronnie Cowan.
Deputy Speaker. Prime Minister, when you read out the line, the government will no longer mandate the wearing of face masks, a number of your backbenchers took off their masks and waved them round their heads. Will the Prime Minister acknowledge, without a hint of irony, that we have a deadly virus still at work in our communities, and it falls upon us all to behave in a manner that encourages people to act in a responsible manner, to be responsible within our own communities?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and I really direct him back to exactly what I said in my earlier remarks, which I'm sure he was listening to.
Derek Thomas.
Statement, which is very, very welcome. And I thank him also for referring to the investment and care taken with vaccine-hesitant groups. And sadly, these groups do exist within the NHS, and the Prime Minister is absolutely right to stress the need for healthcare workers to get the vaccine. However, can I ask the Prime Minister, and I've heard what he said this afternoon, can I ask the Prime Minister to carefully consider the consequence for our NHS in each of our constituencies if we cannot convince the remaining 5% of NHS staff yet to have the vaccine?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker. The answer, and I want to reassure the House that this is a complex and very difficult issue, but it is important that we give NHS staff the strongest possible encouragement to get vaccinated. That requires a lot of work and a lot of effort, and you know, the risks of not being vaccinated are very real.
Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also want to pay tribute to fantastic NHS staff up and down Vauxhall and many volunteers helping with the rollout of the booster jab. I speak regularly to staff at St Thomas's Hospital, my constituency, a hospital that the Prime Minister knows very well, those hard-working staff who cared for him when he was sick with this deadly virus last year. But those staff tell me that they're tired. Those staff tell me that they're stressed mentally. Those staff are burnt out. What is the Prime Minister going to do to address, one, the staffing shortages across our NHS, and two, the sheer mental health stress that our staff are facing day in, day out?
And can I just echo what the Honourable Lady said about the staff at St Thomas's, to whom I obviously owe a massive personal debt. They are indeed wonderful people, and I know that they're tired now, but they've kept going, and London hospitals went through a pretty nasty wave of Omicron, and they got through it brilliantly. We've got to make sure that we continue to support them with investment, but also with more staff. And I find talking to them, that is the thing that really helps. Another pair of hands in the night to help you on the ward, it can make a huge amount of difference. So that's why it's important there are another 44,000 in the NHS this year than there were last year, in 2020 I should say. But we need to do more. And that's why I think that the 36 billion more that we're putting in over 3 years is hugely, hugely necessary. And I don't want to make a political point again, but I wish her side had voted for it.
Andrew Jones.
Deputy Speaker, I welcome the Prime Minister's statement today. I think he's been so right to highlight both the sacrifices made by the British people and the success of the early vaccination and booster programmes. I think this news will be particularly welcome for those desperate to see loved ones in care homes. But there is a risk for those listening to his statement today. They might think that the job is done. Will he continue to ensure the NHS focuses upon making sure as many people as possible can be vaccinated as quickly as possible, particularly amongst the harder to reach groups?